85 to 90% of the discoveries being made in any land of the biblical world today almost immediately agrees with the biblical record. You can quarrel over the 10 or 15% if you want, but most of the archaeological discoveries affirm the biblical record.
There is so much archaeological data that it would be impossible to go over it all. It's simply impossible. However, there are very important finds that I should mention. In 1961, an inscription was found in Caesarea that reads, "To Tiberius Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea," confirming the historical existence of Pontius Pilate and that he was ruling over Judea, exactly as Luke records in his gospel. In fact, we find so much archaeological evidence for the rulers that Luke mentions in his gospel. Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Gallio the Proconsul, in Acts 18. Many figures in the New Testament have been discovered in archaeology, such as Erastus, the treasurer in Corinth, mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans. There have been many ossuaries found dated to that time, one to Alexander, the son of Simon, including a misspelling of Cyrenian. If so, this would be another historical figure mentioned in the Gospels. This comes from Mark chapter 15, verse 21. They even made a discovery in Hierapolis, the lost tomb of Philip the Apostle. They also found an ossuary authenticating the existence of High Priest Caiaphas. The next one isn't exactly proof, but it's most likely that it is a Galilean fishing boat from 1st century Judea. Again, there's so much to go over, it would be impossible to mention in a short period of time. My videos usually are really long, and I'm sure this video is going to be really long as well. Even more important, excavations in Judea find that an earthquake of some kind occurred during the time of Jesus' crucifixion in 33 AD. 2 earthquakes were detected by looking at the layers of built-up sediment, which build up each year, giving us the accuracy of when this earthquake occurred. One earthquake occurred sometime in 31 BC before Christ, and another one occurred sometime anywhere between 26 AD to 36 AD, which exactly fits the earthquakes described during the crucifixion in the Gospels. I'm telling you, the evidence is overwhelming. The final piece of evidence may be the first archaeological discovery that mentions the name of Jesus. In 2002, an ossuary was discovered with the inscription that reads, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." Dr. Andre Lemiere evaluated the ossuary and concludes that the Aramaic script is consistent with 1st century lettering and that it was not possibly made with modern tools. The odds of an ossuary mentioning a brother is very unlikely unless said brother was considered to be famous. Jesus Christ was famous. Scholar Ben Witherington remarked, "As seems probable, the ossuary, found in the vicinity of Jerusalem and dated to about AD 63, is indeed the burial box of James, brother of Jesus. This inscription is the most important extra-biblical evidence of its kind." The final set of evidence that we have is how well the New Testament accounts coheres with ancient history. When this evidence is added up, it easily refutes the idea that the New Testament was written by later forgers. Easily. It demonstrates that the gospel writers were intimately familiar with the culture that they were writing about. For example, in Matthew 17, Jesus is approached by Peter to pay a temple tax of 2 drachma. Jesus teaches him a lesson by telling him where he can find the amount for himself. Peter goes to the sea and finds a shekel, which in ancient Rome was equal to 4 drachma. And Peter was looking for 2 drachma. So this covers it. Matthew records the correct currency exchange that 1 shekel is equal to 4 drachma. Why is this important? Because it's an example that they knew what they were talking about, that they were intimately familiar with the time. If I told you to tell me the proper currency exchange in Mexico 80 years ago, would you be able to do it without the use of the internet? In the same way, when the gospel writers get details like this correct, it matters a lot. Because if they were written after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, they would make numerous errors, demonstrating that they were not even familiar with the culture. Because after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the culture changed dramatically. So if the gospel was written by later forgers, it would be so easy to see that they were not intimately familiar with what 1st century Palestine was actually like. It would be obvious. However, we find over and over again that the New Testament writers got their facts completely right, literally constantly, demonstrating that they were intimately familiar with the culture that they were writing about. To show how much they got right, Nathaniel Lardner wrote Credibility of the Gospel History, which is something I'm trying to add to my bookshelf back there. It is 17 volumes long. So the amount that the Gospels got right with that time period is unprecedented. That simply does not happen if you're a later forger, like the claim that the Bible was fabricated later in like 400 AD. And writing about 1st century Judea is like not easy at all. If you want to get it correct, It's literally, it would be an impossible feat unless you were actually familiar with that time. I mean, the governance changed so much, constantly, literally constantly. First, it was Herod the Great, who wasn't actually that great after all. Herod the Great ruled a united kingdom. Then his kingdom was divided by his 3 sons. Archelaus was never actually meant to be a king. He was never actually a king, but he is allowed to reign. Then Archelaus is removed, and Judea is reduced to a Roman province, run by prefects like Pontius Pilate. However, in 36 AD, Pilate is removed and is replaced with others, which lasts until Herod Agrippa gains kingship of the region. Then he lasts a few years and then dies. Then he is replaced by a system of the procurator and various other rulers. However, Herod Agrippa II is given some power in Judea, but it is limited just to the north. The whole issue is completely chaotic. It changed so much in like a very short period of time. So getting all of those rulers right is very unlikely. Even Roman historians get confused over all the details. But the gospel writers have no problem. So if it was fabricated by later imposters, then it would be easy to mix up the facts. But they didn't. They didn't mix it up at all. They even got to the point of saying that Archelaus was not a king, but only was reigning as one. A later forger would have likely messed this up. Another good point is the issue of crucifixion and burial. The depiction of Jesus' crucifixion correlates with known facts about Roman crucifixion. I also want to point out that crucifixion was an invention by Rome, and crucifixions didn't start occurring until the 1st century. Before that, they did not exist. And in the prophecies of Jesus in Isaiah 53, it prophesies that Jesus will be nailed to a tree. And that was written 680 years before Christ was even born on the earth. Crucifixions didn't exist yet. That's irrelevant to any of this, but I wanted to share that. So they get the depictions correct that is known about Roman crucifixion, such as carrying one's cross and being nailed to it. Many skeptics used to think that the gospel writers were wrong in their depictions of how Jesus was crucified, but it was actually correct. In the book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham compares the amount of names in the gospels with archaeological inscriptions on stones like the ancient Palestinian gravestones and ancient records and ossuaries, and he finds the ratio of names in the gospels correlates almost perfectly to the ratio of names the rest of historical record reveals. It fits far better that they were actually writing about the events of their culture than just simply fabricating it centuries later. Otherwise, these facts, and there are literally hundreds, it's so overwhelming, these facts would not be piling up as they are. Colin Hemmer lists 83 facts that the book of Acts gets right in its final 16 chapters. And when you look at the facts that he gets right, it shows that Luke was very familiar with the time that he was writing about. He knew what he was talking about. Clearly, he gets proper names of ports and local industries and regions and proper lines of boundaries, slang terminology, specific landmark, local variation in languages, proper titles for regional and local officials. For example, he knows the governor of Cyprus in Acts 13:7 is called a proconsul, while in Philippi in Acts 16:20 they're called governors. Meanwhile, in Thessalonica, they're called polytarchs. That's according to Acts 16, verses 6 through 8. And in Ephesus, the chief magistrate is called the town clerk. And that is in Acts 19:35. The ruler in Malta is called the chief man in Acts 28:7. In Athens, Areopagites is the title for a member of their court. And that is in Acts 17:34, etc., etc., and it goes on forever. The amount that they got right is overwhelming. You do not get this kind of accuracy unless you're very familiar with the time period that you're writing about. Craig Bloomberg does the exact same thing as Colin Hemmer and lists 59 facts that John gets right correlating to the time period. And there's still Nathaniel Lardner's 17-volume work waiting for you if you want to investigate more of the facts for yourself. I still want to get that for my bookshelf really badly. I want to get all 17 volumes. And that way I can go, see, the gospel's right, whenever I have somebody over. All of these facts just pile up to show that the New Testament writers knew what they were talking about. Also, there's extra biblical evidence that Jesus did exist, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, that he had followers called Christians who were persecuted and tortured for their enormities, and that there is evidence that there is an earthquake during the time of Jesus' crucifixion along with a solar eclipse. I'm sure NASA, if they wanted to, they can roll back the clock to see if there was a solar eclipse. They should do that. I'm gonna message them about that if I can. So the evidence affirms that the New Testament is a reliable document. I just wanted to point that out. So that's pretty overwhelming if you ask me. If you want to be a skeptic and be like, nah, that's just small coincidence, you can do that, but you're being incredibly illogical. I want to point out that when all these were written, The New Testament wasn't even called the New Testament yet. It was just a bunch of letters that the Apostle Paul and Peter and John and James all wrote to different various churches across the Middle East and Northern Africa and Rome and all over the place. And then they were compiled to create the New Testament. Thank God that we have this, because it's awesome. A lot of people say that there are contradictions in the Bible, in the Gospels. That one Gospel says one thing that Jesus said, and another Gospel says that Jesus said something else. The Gospel writers don't always seem to agree, I'll give you that. But no eyewitnesses ever agree, according to a court of law, on every detail. They're actually considered more reliable if their eyewitnesses differ a little bit. So when your eyewitnesses don't agree on every detail, that is a good thing. That proves authenticity. If they did agree on every detail, you would be suspicious that they collaborated together to match up. Now, what about the theory that the scriptures were corrupted or doctored or adjusted or tweaked or anything like that? Now, let me give you one example. John had 3 students, dedicated students, whose job was reproducing what he wrote, his gospel. And it was almost like ceremonial. You had to write it down exactly the same. And then those 3 students had their own students, and they instructed them to do exactly what John taught them to do, to write down the gospels exactly as he told them to. And what about the fact that we've retranslated over and over and over again? It was first written down in Greek, then it was translated to Latin, then it was translated to German, then it was translated to New King James, then it was translated to blah, 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 blah. If we translated it from the most recent translation, then we might have a corruption. But every time a new translation comes out, they go back to the oldest text that we have, the oldest manuscripts. By the way, there is over 5,800 New Testament manuscripts in our possession today, which is more than any other historical document in possession. The New Testament is the most reliable document that we have. I'm not particularly fond of the Catholic Church, but we can thank them for that. The fact that they so diligently duplicated the New Testament so that we could have this, so we can read the story of Jesus, so that it can inspire and change people's lives, like it has mine. So, were the scriptures corrupted? No, they just kept passing on the torch to the next person, ensuring that each generation did it exactly the same as the last. It was almost ceremonial, all the way until the canonization. We even have original Greek manuscripts, which is insane. That was even before the Latin ones, before the true authentic Christian church turned into the Roman Catholic Church. We have the original Greek, some of them. I also want to reiterate the fact that the disciples were fearless, and they believed with all their heart in what they had seen, without a doubt, even to the point of being tortured and killed for their beliefs. Everything you've heard so far are arguments from other apologists that I've used in this video as evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. The following arguments are arguments of my own, all centered in circular reasoning. I want to leave this video with the last question. Were the gospel writers biased? After all, how can we trust the scriptures because they were written by Christians? Of course they're going to say that Jesus lived. It's written by Christians, right? Maybe they just lied about what they saw in order to gain something from it. Well, let's list a few reasons why people give false witness. Money, power, and sexual lust. Were the gospel writers getting tail left and right? Were they getting laid? No. And forget the Roman Catholic Church, because that didn't happen until 300 AD. Forget them for a moment. We're talking about the real early Christian church. Did they get in power for what they believed in? No. They were persecuted, tortured, and murdered for what they believed in, yet they proclaimed it anyway. What about money? No. They got no money for what they believed in. So what purpose would they have for spreading the gospel? By the way, I want to bring up Joseph Smith. Did the founder of Mormonism have any reasons to lie? He wrote in the scriptures that his people were going to support him financially. Dude had over 34 wives. And what about power? At the time, the only standing army that it was even close to the size of the army of the United States, the dude even ran for president. Now, does this mean that he is guilty of something necessarily? No. This just means that he has the motive to lie. Nobody does anything without a motive. And the only motive that the gospel writers had was sharing their testimony to the ends of the earth like Jesus told them to. Spreading the news of the gospel. Doing it for the glory of the one that they so firmly believe in, that I so firmly believe in. I'm not going to get emotional, but my point is they didn't have any reason to spread the gospel other than the one that Jesus gave them. Look at the life of the apostles for a moment. It's not looking good for these guys. Peter was crucified upside down. John was boiled alive in oil and survived and was exiled to the island of Patmos. Bartholomew was flayed alive, skinned alive for believing what he did. And he knew that other people were being killed the exact same way. He proclaimed it anyway. And yes, people do some crazy things for what they believe in. but they don't do it knowing that what they believe in is a lie. This was thousands of people who continue to proclaim, after all the horrible things they've seen that are done to Christians, they did it anyway. They did it because they truly, just like me, just like millions of other people in this world, they believed in Jesus. They died professing what they believed because they truly believed it, not to gain anything from it. That idea is ridiculous. Proclaiming that Jesus was Lord was extremely unpopular. It didn't give them power, money, or women. What about the idea that you can't trust the gospel writers because they were Christians, and Christians have bias? I mean, they're Christians, so of course they're going to write about Jesus. That's just silly. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a group of about 500 people in Central Park in Manhattan, and they all suddenly see a unicorn appear right in front of them. And the unicorn says, "It is I, the great unicorn. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Go and tell people what you have seen and heard." And then he just vanishes. And everyone around them is mumbling amongst themselves, "Did you just see that right now? Did you see the yeah, I saw the unicorn, bro. That was weird." And they all agree that they saw what they saw. That they didn't just somehow hallucinate it, because two people can't hallucinate the same thing any more than two people can dream the same thing, let alone 500, which is exactly what the Apostle Paul describes. He describes 500 people seeing Jesus after he was crucified. So they all agree to believe in the same thing, and the reporter says, "Oh, well, we can't trust them. We can't trust their testimonies. I mean, after all, they're unicornians." That's stupid. The same applies to Christians. They believed what they believed because they witnessed it with their own eyes. That doesn't mean their testimony is biased. Just because they turned into Christians because of what they had seen, that doesn't make their testimony any less reliable. That's like saying, "Oh, you saw what you saw, but now that since you saw what you saw, I can't trust that you saw what you saw because you said that you saw what you saw." It doesn't make any sense. It's circular reasoning. It makes no sense. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean your testimony is biased. Like I say in every video, I'm not telling you this because I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian because of what I have learned to be true, what I have experienced. Oh, I can't trust his account because after all, he is a Christian. He's a Christian because of what he has seen. I didn't make this video because I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian because of what I have learned to be true. And that's why I'm making this video. I didn't used to be a Christian. My mind was just as blown as the disciples and the apostles were. I have seen what I have seen. I have experienced what I have experienced. And I've studied what I've studied. And I know what I know. And I'm sharing this with you because of that and no other reason. I don't have anything to gain out of sharing this with you. These accounts were written by Christians who weren't Christians before they experienced what they experienced. So using the Bible to prove the Bible is perfectly valid. This is an eyewitness testimony. This is equivalent of an audio recording. This is proof. They started something truly incredible, something very powerful, had to compel them to do the very opposite of everything that their instincts were telling them not to do. Everything screamed that proclaiming Jesus would inevitably lead to their torture and death, but they did it anyway. So there's very good reason to trust them, even though they are already Christian. So we have internal evidence that the Gospels were written in the late 40s. We have external sources attesting to the life and ministry of Jesus. We have archaeological evidence confirming the biblical accounts. We have 2 extra biblical sources mentioning the crucifixion of Jesus and a supposed solar eclipse. We have evidence of a possible earthquake during the time of his crucifixion. And we know that the Gospel writers had absolutely nothing to gain out of lying about what they had seen. The Roman Catholic Church is a completely different story because they didn't come on the scene until the early 300s AD. Before that, the Romans were crucifying and flaying and burning Christians alive for what they believed. It wasn't until the Christians became overwhelming that the Romans had no other choice but to embrace the faith. And when that happened, that is when it turned into a form of government. That is when it turned into a form of military. This is what I'm going to talk about in my next video. The Christian Church is not the Catholic Church. And the early, real, authentic Christians had no reason to lie about what they believe. You guys are awesome. I really hope you learned something from this video. When I examined all this evidence, I was blown away, and I really, really hope that you consider the truth of what I've talked about in this video. What's going on? I know, I don't have facial hair. I just wanted to add one more thing before I end this video. I've been working on this video for 2 whole days. I'm just wrapping it up. I know it was long, and I want to apologize for that. I needed to add a few more things before I end this video. One more problem that people have, that skeptics have. What about people who didn't mention Jesus? I would like to point out one thing. That's another one of my circular reasoning arguments, like the one you heard before. I want to point out the fact that the people who actually did see Jesus' miracles became Christians afterwards. So according to your logic, skeptics watching this video, if they're Christians, their testimonies aren't reliable anymore, correct? According to your logic? What's my point? My point is there's no such thing as non-Christians who saw Jesus' miracles. Why? Because after seeing them, they became Christians. And I want to point out the fact that the New Testament didn't used to be the New Testament. It was just a compilation of people writing letters about Jesus. If those were somehow outside of the Bible, you would consider them valid, correct? But no, they were added into the Bible later. What's my point? My point is, the Bible is a valid historical document. It's just as valid as any external evidence. I'd also like to point out the fact that it took us 2,000 years to find the towns of Bethlehem and Nazareth. Those towns were made of stone, and it took us 2,000 years to find them. How hard do you think it would be to find things that are made of paper, or papyrus, or papyrus, whatever you want to call it? If it took us that long to find something made of stone, how easy do you think it would be to find something that's 2,000 years old, written on paper, and still intact? The fact that we find anything talking about Jesus in the first century is simply a miracle. There are many extra biblical accounts talking about Jesus that I already mentioned. Somehow these don't count? Why? That is classic cognitive dissonance at its finest. You're provided the evidence that you've been asking for, and then when it's provided to you, you say it's not good enough. I gave skeptics in this video evidence for the Christian faith, but I know that many people who are watching this are going to say that it wasn't good enough. When is there enough evidence? And I'm not saying believe in the deity of Christ. I'm saying, when is there enough evidence to believe that Jesus existed even? If you really want to be taken seriously, like the respectable scholars who accept the historical existence of Jesus, then accept this evidence that I provided in this video. This isn't my evidence. The only thing that was actually my arguments were the things that I talked about a few minutes ago about circular reasoning. Those were my arguments. All the other stuff is arguments from other scholars that I've studied and researched and provided for you in this video. But the evidence that I've provided in this video should allow you to come to a conclusion that Jesus existed. You ask for sources outside of the Bible that talk about Jesus of Nazareth. I provide them, and for some reason they're not good enough. If this video isn't enough to prove to you that Jesus existed, then I don't know what will. I preached my heart out in this one. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Have an awesome day. Seriously.